All right, so Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah, and peace be upon you all, and welcome to this new episode of our live stream after show in Seeing God in Biology. So with Dr. Fuz Rana. Fuz, how are you doing today?
Ahmed, I'm doing great. I hope you're doing well also.
Alhamdulillah, all is well, and I'll take this opportunity to congratulate everyone in the Muslim world, because today is middle of Sha'ban, Laylat al-Nisf min Sha'ban, which is, by the way, the night where, the deeds for the whole lunar year would be sort of reconciled. So it's like you're doing all the, taking all those quizzes all over the year, and then you take the full mark this night. So I hope this would be a rewarding night for everybody. And I think we already had some questions on the live stream on the primary episode. So I'll just pick some questions up from there until people would actually, I would recommend that if you have put a question over there, that you can actually, you would bring it up here. So here's the first question we had, and it's for you, Fuz. Let me put it onto the banners and show it on the screen. First, I think we had some great comments about the matter of the replication itself being so impressive, and all the machinery that God has created to make this process work, which is really absolutely mind-blowing. So here is the first question we had. So it says, Dr. Rana, can you give an example of how contrived some of these origin of life experiments are, and why are so few scientists calling out these manipulated conditions? Yeah, and maybe to start answering the question, a little bit of explanation of what contrived would mean in a chemistry context. What kind of setup would be considered?
Yeah, I mean, this is
this
is a really great question, and it's a very important question that original life researchers have really neglected. And when you're talking about trying to understand the origin of life from an evolutionary perspective, the overarching model is that some type of chemical evolution transformed simple molecules into the very first cells. And unfortunately, original life researchers can't actually really go back in time and piece together what potentially could have happened when life appears on Earth. We have a very scant geochemical and fossil record for the very earliest life on Earth. But what does become very evident is that life appears very suddenly in Earth's history, and that the very first organisms that appear are simple single-celled organisms. But the inference from the geochemical profiles that these organisms have left behind is that these were metabolically complex organisms. So the only alternative that original life researchers really have is to try to go in the lab and to replicate the different steps they think may have transpired when they are trying to understand chemical evolution. And there are really three goals of these experiments. One is what we could call proof of principle, right? Is the chemistry or the physics that we need for differing steps in the origin of life even possible? And then if we identify, potential chemical or physical processes that could be in play, what is the mechanistic undergirding of them? And then last but not least, are these processes relevant to the geochemical conditions of the early Earth? And I would say that original life researchers have been successful with respect to the first two goals and they failed miserably with respect to the third goal, which is to show geochemical relevance. And so, let me just give one example. This is my favorite example, but there's countless examples we could give. But we've talked about the RNA World Hypothesis a few times, already, in Seeing God in Biology. And, one of the pieces of evidence that people will point to as in support of the RNA World Hypothesis are experiments that have been done going back into the mid-1990s in the lab, where people can start with RNA building blocks and have clay function as a catalyst to drive the formation of RNA polymers. And so the idea here is that if you had an early Earth environment that was an aqueous environment, that doesn't lend itself to polymerization, because that polymerization is a condensation reaction generating water as a byproduct. But in an aqueous environment, the equilibrium is going to lie in the opposite direction of that reaction, where the reverse reaction is going to be thermodynamically stable, not the forward reaction. And so the discovery that clay could function as a catalyst is exciting, because clay has these interstitial spaces where these building block materials could accumulate, and has chemical groups that could function as catalysts. And so the thought is, wow, if this happens in the lab, then maybe clays and other minerals on the early Earth could drive the formation of RNA polymers, a very important step, in the RNA World Hypothesis. The problem is that when you examine these experiments in the lab, they're done under these highly contrived conditions, as the person posing this question points out. For example, these reactions only work if the solvent is distilled water, right? If you have any kind of ions present, the reactions don't work. In fact, you have to get the clay from a special supplier and treat the clay before it can serve as a catalyst, where you strip away all the counter ions and replace them all with sodium. You have to use essentially not RNA building blocks, but RNA building blocks that have been chemically activated so that they will actually react. If you used unactivated RNA building blocks, the reactions don't work. And there's no way that you could get chemically activated RNA building blocks on the early Earth. These experiments also exclude other materials that would inhibit RNA polymerization or cause RNA polymers to break down. And these materials would have been present on the early Earth. And so it's a chemically pristine setup in the lab. And then last but not least, they stop the reaction before the RNA polymer gets too long, because once it exceeds a certain length, it'll become irreversibly absorbed onto the clay and would be unavailable for subsequent steps in the origin of life. So in other words, this reaction works. It works really well in the laboratory when you have organic chemists overseeing the process.
And what would be the result of the reaction at the end?
It would be essentially an RNA polymer. Is that what you're asking?
Yeah. So what would an RNA polymer that is sitting on a piece of clay do if you just leave it there?
Well, I mean, the idea would be you're not going to be able to ever have an RNA world if you don't have a mechanism for the building blocks to form the polymer to begin with. Once that polymer is there, then you're hoping that through random processes, you're going to generate enough different types of RNA polymers that some of them will then be useful for some kind of, useful towards ultimately self-replication. So, to your point, there's an enormous gap between an RNA polymer and the the RNA world, but it's a necessary first step. If you can't even form the polymers, then the RNA world doesn't work. So there was a lot of excitement with these experiments, but the problem is that, again, it's a highly contrived set of conditions that would never exist on the early Earth. And so you have people like Paul Davies in his book, The Fifth Miracle, saying that as far as organic, as far as biochemists can see, generating, self-replicators from scratch would be impossible without an organic chemist there to superintend the process. Or I was at an Origin of Life conference a number of years ago where Jim Ferris, who died a few years ago now, was one of the scientists doing a lot of the work looking at RNA assembly on clay, and he presented a paper at this Origin of Life conference. And during the Q&A session, Bob Shapiro, who is when he was alive, was an organic chemist that I think the City University of New York, basically raised his hand and he said, "Jim, what you've done is you've demonstrated intelligent design." And it was, it was as they say, it went over. It went over like a fart at church, is the expression I heard growing up, right? It was like the one thing that you could not say in that setting. And, I was very impressed with Jim Ferris because he remained calm, but literally you could see his face going from
changing color,
changing colors right before your eyes. The fact that he didn't blow up was amazing. But Bob Shapiro's point was that, what's guaranteed the success of that experiment is essentially the researcher involvement. And in fact, I wrote a book called Creating Life in the Lab, where I raised this very concern. That was the theme of the book. And I took a lot of flack for that, for raising that point. But interestingly enough, in 2018, a German Origin of Life researcher wrote an article for Nature Communications called Prebiotic Chemistry and Human Intervention, where he raised that very concern that most of the work in prebiotic chemistry is really irrelevant to the origin of life because we've not accounted for unwarranted researcher involvement. But the reason why origin of life researchers, I think, don't recognize this is because in their minds, they conflate proof of principle results with geochemical relevance. And so for many of them, hey, if we can discover a possible chemical reaction, that means we've kind of solved the problem without really asking the question, is this really geochemically relevant? Now, what's interesting to me is that this problem that's being exposed of unwarranted researcher involvement actually leads you to an argument for God's necessary role in the origin of life. Because if empirically we show time and time again, intelligent agency is indispensable to get different types of chemical transformations to take place that we would need for chemical evolution, then by analogy, should we not think that on the early Earth, there had to be, quote unquote, a divine organic chemist that was, somehow intervening to bring about the origin of life? So this problem that is, raised in the question is now a problem that, interestingly enough, is being recognized more widely by origin of life researchers. And, the theological implications connected with this problem are, obvious, I think, to most people.
Yeah, but actually, I didn't want to cut you off, but it raised at least 3 points in my mind I'd like to share with you.
Sure.
So the first one is when you were talking about clay. I'm not very sure about that one. So is it there anywhere in the Bible mentioning clay in the creation of Adam?
It is Genesis 2 talks about Adam being made from the dust of the earth, but and then you do see references in both the Old and the New Testament to the idea that as human beings we are like clay in the potter's hands, where the analogy is that God is shaping us, right? That we are the handiwork of God and that God is shaping us. And And that, I think that allusion to clay connects to the idea of, humans being made out of the dust of the earth, right? That clay too is, a material from the earth that the God, that a potter would shape, and that likewise, if by analogy, we are like clay in God's hands where he shapes us.
Yeah, but what drew my attention is actually when you were saying that it cannot be just clay, it needs to be a certain type of clay that is actually, like it has to be pure and this kind specific kind of clay. So, right? Is that right? So if I just
Yes.
go to my garden and I just pick up some, clay and mix it with water, this will not be the right thing. I need to bring a special purified kind of clay. Is that it?
Yes.
So the reason it struck me is this ayah in the Quran, this verse in the Quran. It says, وَلَقَدْ خَلَقْنَا الْإِنسَانَ مِنْ سُلَالَةٍ مِنْ طِينٍ. And we have indeed created the human from sulala is when you have something and you do picky selection of a certain component of that thing. Okay, so وَلَقَدْ خَلَقْنَا الْإِنسَانَ مِنْ سُلَالَةٍ مِنْ طِينٍ, it means we have indeed created the human from a selection of clay, a specific purification of clay or something. So it strikes me that not just any clay, but it needs to be hand-picked clay. You buy it from a supplier, and it really struck me when you were describing it. Immediately struck me. I remembered that. Yeah, so it's really striking how the text is really congruent to that. And then the second thing that you were saying is that the designer of the experiment needs to keep on guiding it, to lead it somewhere, otherwise it goes nowhere. The funny thing is the same word. So there is another ayah in the Quran that talks about selecting. So this one that I mentioned is about the process of creation of Adam himself, peace be upon him. And then the second one is about the creation of everybody else, me and you. And he uses again the same expression. I'll also put it on the screen. It's talking about the sequence of the creation of a human being, and then it says like this: ثُمَّ جَعَلْنَا نَسْلَهُ مِنْ سُلَالَةٍ مِنْ مَاءٍ مَهِينٍ. And then we made his offspring from a sulala again, which is picked selection, one thing of many, min ma'in mahin, from despised water. And this is typically a term that refers to sperm. So and then we know that there's those millions and maybe billions of spermatozoas, or I think they're called, and then just few of them, or a small amount, survives until they reach the egg, and only the best one can actually penetrate. So it's like the word sulala again is like not any sperm, not any piece of that specific male water will there is a very picky selection process. And then it again strikes me the way you were describing the clay. And then the third thing that hits me is the okay, so if by any means even prebiotic earth enables that an RNA polymer happens, will the sequence mean anything is a question. It will be just, how would they, progress their argument? Even if you get an RNA polymer, then what?
Yeah, well, and the idea would be, to represent origin of life researchers for a moment, the idea would be, well, you would generate a large population of these RNAs, and hopefully within that population, some of them would be of some, biochemical utility. But, you're running into the problem of, irreducible complexity that our friend Michael Behe raises, and it's, let's say hypothetically, you wind up with a ribozyme, out of that process that is able to catalyze a reaction. So what? I mean, it's no different than having an RNA molecule that's completely non-functional, because the functionality only works within the larger context of, of the entire system, where other ribozymes are operating as well with unique functionality that is designed in such a way to contribute to the overall, positively to the overall operations of the cell or the protocell. So, the idea that you could, again, even if you did happen upon something that was functional, it would really make very little difference, and even if you could produce a self-replicator, a naked self-replicator isn't going to last very long, under the conditions of the early Earth. It has to be encapsulated, and it has to have other, systems in play that are working with it to sustain its activity. So
absolutely,
yeah. So it doesn't solve the problem, but again, the way original life researchers at that time viewed it was, this is an important clue that at least at minimum meets a minimum requirement for the RNA world hypothesis to even have credibility.
All right. Okay. So what you're saying is that origin of life would think, okay, for life, then we need genetic molecule or enzymatic autocatalytic thing. RNA can be a good candidate. Let's see if RNA can happen. Okay, if it doesn't happen, let's make it happen. And okay, we made it happen. But then at the end of the day, you've just put one piece of the puzzle, but it doesn't fit in the bigger context anyway. So it's like a proof of concept, and maybe they're hoping that at a point of time the pieces will come together. Is this how this works?
Yes, I mean, you usually will see original life researchers talk about, hey, this is a piece of the puzzle, or this is an important clue, but almost all of them would acknowledge we still don't have any real understanding, or we've not made any real progress. It's one thing to, if you have 1,000-piece jigsaw puzzle, it's one thing to find, a handful of the pieces underneath your couch, but it's another thing entirely to, to actually assemble the puzzle from those handful of pieces. And even if you had all the pieces, you still have to have, some mechanism that's going to drive, the assembly into the final, into the complete puzzle. And so, the best that original life researchers have are disparate clues, but a lot of times what I see happening is, people will point to those clues, and then in their mind that's all they need to be satisfied that chemical evolution is the way to explain the origin of life, as opposed to really meeting the demands that you would expect for any other theory in any other context, which is, okay, it's fine if that idea, may have some glimmer of hope, but until we've got everything completely worked out, you can't say that the theory is valid by any means. So
yeah. So I think this would wrap it up. So he says, would you say origin of life experiments are still highly contrived? And why aren't these researchers admitting their manipulated conditions? It seems they always have wishful thinking. So in your example, in that conference, did the presenter, what was the response of the presenter when Bob Shapiro raised his hand and said, you've proved?
It was
design.
essentially, he just simply dismissed the question as being, ludicrous and
okay.
really inappropriate. So there wasn't really an engagement. Now, again, I am beginning to see more and more origin of life researchers actually acknowledging this as a concern. And what they will oftentimes do is have some discussion as to why they think their particular experiment may have relevance to a prebiotic setting. Usually they are extremely charitable to their own conclusions, if you will, and it's human nature to try to put your work in the best possible light. I understand that, but to me, the good news is that this problem is being acknowledged now, but what is being resisted is the obvious theological implications, of that work. Because, to me, if every time you do you have success with prebiotic chemistry in the lab, and what you show is that ultimately, researcher involvement is integral to the success, that should be telling you something about what it takes for chemical evolution to transpire. What's interesting is there's an emerging area of biology called synthetic biology, which is kind of like an amalgam of engineering and biology, where the goal is to create artificial organisms. And as a subset of that work is work trying to create synthetic protocells that would be these chemical supersystems that assume the properties of life. And there, again, in a sense, you have researchers trying to create life in the lab. So it's an analogous activity to work in prebiotic chemistry. And again, the conclusion from synthetic biology is the same as you get from prebiotic chemistry. Intelligent agency is needed to develop these fairly sophisticated experimental strategies for how they're even going to tackle the problem of creating a protocell, and then, when you look at what it requires to turn that strategy into actual work in the lab, there's additional work that has to be done to develop protocols. Many of them are ingenious, and highly impressive. And then you have highly skilled, highly knowledgeable scientists, working under extremely controlled conditions in the lab to assemble these systems that are just impressive on one hand, but in comparison to even the simplest cell, you're looking at, vast distances in terms of complexity and functionality. And so, you're seeing an independent confirmation of that result by the work in synthetic biology.
All right. Great. So the good news is that it's starting to get acknowledged, and the ingredient of intelligent agency is becoming more pronounced as people try to actually do the whole thing, right?
Yes.
So they have to face the real challenges, not just pieces of the puzzle. If you really want to have a functioning protocell, now show me the whole thing, not just pieces, because it will not work with disconnected pieces. This is the fact on the ground. Yeah. We have here a comment, seems about an interview that you have had, or a debate. So it says, Dr. Rana, I saw your debate with Erica, the atheist, and it was hilarious. The points she brings against less knowledgeable people, she never raised with you. So it seems he was, watching more of her debates. You spent 30 minutes on cave paintings. Okay, well, what did cave paintings have to do with it?
Well, at least in Christian circles, a lot of times people will see the cave art, that the ancient cave art, for example, in the caves in France and Germany and Spain. And now we're discovering cave art in Southeast Asia, which is really very exciting. And they're troubled by that, because their first reaction is that this seems to support kind of an evolutionary model for the origin of humanity, and that it kind of undermines the biblical account of human origins. And my point is that the cave paintings are actually I think, very powerful evidence for what we might call human exceptionalism. Darwin's idea in The Descent of Man was that, that everything about us kind of emerged gradually in an evolutionary manner, and that the creatures that preceded us were, had the antecedents of those properties that we think make us unique and special as human beings. And so, we only differ in degree, not kind. And yet, like in the creation account in Genesis, we see that human beings are made in God's image, and that we are made in such a way that we stand apart from all other creatures. And so that we seem to be unique and exceptional. Well, something that's rather interesting is there's a growing number of anthropologists, even though they view human origins in evolutionary terms, that are actually arguing that human beings are different in kind, not different in degree, and that they're arguing for human exceptionalism. And as I recall, Erica was in agreement with me that that human beings really are exceptional, and so I'm meeting more and more anthropologists who agree to human exceptionalism. And what they think that makes us exceptional is our capacity for symbolism, that we are the only creatures that have the ability to represent the world with symbols. And it's not just simply concrete objects that we represent with symbols, but abstract concepts as well. And that we also have the ability to manipulate the symbols, to combine them and recombine them in a wide variety of ways, and through that process be able to create narrative, to create meaning, and so that those two capacities are manifested in language most evidently, but also in music and in art. And so artistic expression is a type of symbolism. And and what we see is that the cave art in Europe actually is younger in age than the cave art in Asia, which means that humans must have carried with them this capacity for art before they even began to migrate around the world. And that the more that we're looking at the archaeological record, the closer and closer artistic expression goes back, to converge with the time where modern humans appear, where Homo sapiens sapiens appear, and so language doesn't preserve in the archaeological record, but art does. And so many anthropologists see art as a proxy for language, right? And and some of the cave art is incredibly sophisticated. Actually, it's not these crude paintings on the wall. It's very sophisticated in terms of the artistic techniques that are used. It's evident that some of this art is actually narrative in nature. It's almost like the first comic books are in the cave art that we see on the walls, where there's a story being told, where there are things that are depicted that show an understanding of an imaginary world. The location of this art is sometimes deep in chambers that are highly inaccessible, where the view is that maybe this art had religious significance, that there was a religious expression connected with this art. One of my favorite discoveries is some of the art, and I'm drawing a blank on the name of the cave, so I apologize, but I believe it's a cave system in France, where the discovery was that the art was placed in locations that created a multisensory experience. So they would have depictions of a herd of buffalo, for example, or bison, and that in that part of the cave, if you made certain sounds, the echoing would create the sense of a thundering herd, right?
Wow.
Or that there would be places in the cave that would be exceptionally quiet, and that's where you would see, big cats being depicted, right, which are, animals that stalk their prey and that are very quiet. So there was like this multi-sensory experience, connected to the art.
Very
and so,
interesting.
so anyway, so in other words, that art is reflecting an incredibly sophisticated capacity, to communicate, and it goes beyond just simply copying what we see in the world, and that, to me, what's interesting is that it's only humans that display this capacity. The claims of Neanderthal art are, they fall short for a number of reasons. And so it really does look like, human beings are exceptional. So my point was that cave art really reinforces the notion of human exceptionalism, and really calls attention to the fact that there aren't evolutionary models that can explain the origin of language, or hence the origin of symbolism. This capacity for symbolism seems to be unique to modern humans, and it seems to show up, really suddenly when modern humans appear on the scene, and that there's not this bridge between non-symbolic behavior and symbolic behavior. There really is a chasm, and so that's really kind of the point there of the idea of cave art.
Great. Actually, I had this series that I recorded like a year ago. It was called On Evolution, and episode 3 was about humans, and I was actually making the argument from pottery and those weapons and cave drawings, that language and symbolism. And I was actually making the argument that if at that time Neanderthals were said to be sort of ancestors to humans, then maybe Neanderthals are just humans. Yeah. They're just humans. What's your idea about that? And let me ask you another question that also goes back to genetics. So some go like this: if humans have just appeared on Earth from just a man and a woman, how would that create the genetic diversity? If you just have 2 sets of chromosomes, how would that? So let's start with the first one. What's your idea? Are Neanderthals just humans and just one race of humans? Maybe do you think this is it's possible to entertain this possibility given the evidence?
I'm of the opinion that Neanderthals were distinct from modern humans, that they were creatures that God created that existed for a period of time and went extinct. And so I see them as being, fascinating creatures that obviously had some intellectual and emotional capacity, which is true for, other primates as well, like, chimps and gorillas display that, those kind of qualities as well. So I just see them in kind of in that same vein, that they are creatures that God made that existed for a period of time that went extinct. Remarkable creatures, but I would argue that they were cognitively inferior to humans, and that they lacked, what I would call, as a Christian, the image of God. And so, that would be my particular view on Neanderthals. But that among Christians, what you do with Neanderthals is heavily disputed, and so my model is one, and there's other people that would take a view that maybe Neanderthals were actually just a subgrouping of humans, that they should be categorized with humans, and so it's again an area that is there's no consensus among Christians that work in this area.
So those drawings would be typically, the cave drawings, would be attributed to the Neanderthal line or to the Homo sapiens sapien line?
They would be attributed to Homo sapiens sapiens. Now, there was a claim that Neanderthals did some of that artwork because the artwork was dated to an age that was earlier than people thought that modern humans had made their way into Europe. Although there's some recent studies that suggest that modern humans made their way into Europe much earlier than people originally thought. But the problem is that it's very difficult to date the cave art. You can, if you have, if the pigment that was used is charcoal, you can do potentially, carbon-14 dating on it, but you're dealing with ages that are really at the cusp of where carbon-14 dating no longer becomes really robust and reliable. So one approach that was developed, it's actually a very clever approach, is that there's water that will run down the walls of caves, and that water will deposit calcite on the cave walls, and in that calcite would be some uranium and thorium. And so what it's done is that if you get the calcite layers underneath the art and on top of the art, that gives you, and then you use uranium thorium dating, that gives you essentially a bracket for what the date of the cave art would be. And so there was a study done surveying a number of cave art specimens throughout Europe, and almost all of them returned back a date that would be consistent with Homo sapiens sapiens. There was a couple of them that gave dates at about 65,000 years in age. And so they argued, well, this must be the work of Neanderthals. The problem is that they were getting discordant dates from the same piece of art. So part of the art was dating it, younger, and part was dating older. And it was really only a few specimens that gave that higher age. Well, it turns out that this technique is a bit tricky to use, because once the calcite is deposited, water will continue to flow over it. And uranium is actually more soluble than thorium. And so what happens is that you're preferentially removing uranium, which now gives you an artificially high level of thorium, which would make the art seem older than it actually is. And so to use the technique requires an enormous amount of diligence to make sure that hasn't happened, right? And so since that work was published, the follow-up studies have disputed the claim of Neanderthal art. But the art that we're seeing now in Southeast Asia is older than the art in Europe, and that art was unequivocally made by modern humans. And what's interesting is that it's the same, qualitatively, it's the same type of art. That the stylistically, it's the same art. So there's it creates kind of a unity in terms of artistic style. So it's really interesting. And there's she's an anthropologist by the name of Guinevere von Pitzinger, I think is her name. But she has done some really interesting work where in the cave system, she's discovered these symbols. And there's about 30 some symbols that she's identified that occur repeatedly throughout these different caves. And so she's actually of the opinion that this may be like a proto-language, or a proto-written language, where there are these different symbols that were, in addition to the art, that were being used to communicate. So, the whole question of cave art is fascinating, and who did it, what was their motivation? It's a grand mystery, but it's absolutely fascinating. But I think it really does highlight the fact that that if you hold to the view that human beings are exceptional, that you're well justified in doing it. That's really the larger point. And that idea is, I think, critical to defending the image of God.
Amazing. And then the question would be, okay, if we attribute those cave paintings to modern humans or Homo sapiens sapiens, there will still be the burials and the other features attributed to Neanderthals. Are those now being reconsidered too, that they were for humans?
Yeah,
What?
there's a dispute as, I mean, you know, there's a dispute as to whether or not those burials with Neanderthals were authentic burials. You know, it could be that in some instances these are accidental graves as opposed to deliberate burials. If they were
Mm,
deliberate burials, it just simply be caching the dead. That's a common practice among animals where they will kind of
mm,
create graveyards of sorts, you know.
mm,
And if again it was deliberate, was it ritualistic? I don't know that there's any evidence that supports ritualistic burials in the way that you would see, you know, the burials that modern humans engage in. Um, and so that's being disputed as well. You know, it looks like Neanderthals had some, they made use of fire, but it probably was an opportunistic use of fire where they were using the fire that would result from natural fires that they would then be able to kind of capture and make use of it. But I don't know that there's good evidence that Neanderthals had mastery of fire where they could deliberately start a fire. Or, you know, yeah. So every piece of evidence that's being used, that is used to kind of argue for the humanness of Neanderthals, is disputed. You know, now,
uh,
you know, and so to be fair, you could make the argument both ways, right? Because of the dispute, you could take the view that I take, which is Neanderthals were cognitively inferior, or you could take the other view that they were, you know,
just
like
humans.
us. Yeah.
Yeah.
So
Or they were actually us, because then the question of, and I really would like to listen to a genetic explanation for when it is said that 2 to 4% of modern human DNA is actual Neanderthal DNA. What does that actually mean?
in other words, when you sequence the Neanderthal genome, there are certain regions of the genome that have um, kind of a signature that is distinct and unique to Neanderthals,
Mm,
right? And so in the human genome, you'll see regions where you'll see those Neanderthal signatures, and so the thought is that there would be some kind of interbreeding taking place, and in fact, like, you know, most likely you and I both have about 2% Neanderthal DNA in our genomes, would
mm,
be my guess. And but it's quite likely that the 2% I have would be different than the 2% you have. In other words, we might have numerically the same proportion of Neanderthal DNA, but the sequences we have are not are distinct. And so people have claimed that you can reconstruct about 40% of the Neanderthal genome from human genome sequences by, you know,
okay.
cataloging all of the Neanderthal sequences that we found. So, but what's interesting is that there are some regions of the human genome where there's absolutely no Neanderthal DNA whatsoever. These are called Neanderthal gene deserts. And it turns out that those regions actually are regions that code for genes that are involved in neurological development and cranial facial development and things like that. So there seems to be some regions of the human genome that are kind of protected from Neanderthal influence. You know, so
Okay. So
so
if
you know,
uh, how can we then say that this signature is coming from Neanderthals? Maybe it is just a common thing between us and Neanderthals, like we have some common things between us and bananas and oranges. And
yeah. And again, there's like there are like these variants that you see, you know, in the Neanderthal genomes that you don't necessarily see uniformly in the human genome. So these seem to be distinct Neanderthal variants, and you know the size of the size of the Neanderthal sequences are fairly small. You know, and they're not necessarily catenated together, and so you could actually use that to estimate the time frame when the interbreeding events would have taken place. So there's like it all kind of fits, kind of all fits together, I guess, for the case for interbreeding. You can only detect interbreeding because there are signatures in the Neanderthal genome that are unique to Neanderthals. That can serve as diagnostics.
Okay, so if interbreeding is interbreeding the only explanation, or it is a probable explanation in your opinion?
It's a probable explanation. Now, I have seen a minority of anthropologists challenge the idea, and what they're arguing is that if you have certain demographic events that are taking place, that those types of demographic effects on the population could give you a signature that would be similar to the signature that people are pointing to as evidence for Neanderthal interbreeding. So I think most anthropologists would take Neanderthal human interbreeding as being orthodoxy or scientific orthodoxy, but there are a few people that have challenged that idea, and again have shown through modeling studies that you can generate the same kind of an effect. In fact, I think I just saw a paper recently that I was going to probably blog about. Let's see here, that was making that point. It was a fairly recent paper. Yeah, so this paper was that I have in front of me. It was published.
You can share it if you would like, by the way.
Oh, yeah, that's true. Let's see here.
So you can press share screen or something. Yeah, that would be.
Let's do that. Yeah, thank you. Okay. Is it? Have I shared the screen?
Not yet.
Let's see here. I still haven't shared it, have I?
No.
All right, something. I'm not sure why it's not allowing me to do that here. So let's try it again.
Yeah, you press the share, and then you have share screen once again.
Right.
And then you say share screen, and then you select a window or entire screen. Select a window. You need to pick the window itself.
Oh, it's not. Somehow Chrome doesn't have permission.
Okay.
Oh. Okay. So.
Whoops. Sorry, guys. So it seems we lost Dr. Rana while he was trying to share the screen. Probably he'll be back. So we'll just wait for a minute for Dr. Rana to be back. Okay, it seems Chrome rebelled against you.
Yes. Well, and it might have been my fault too, because I just started pushing buttons.
Yeah. Okay. Did you give it the permission? Yeah.
You know what I'll do is I'll just put a link,
Yeah.
the bibliographic information in the chat, and
Okay.
then maybe you could share it.
Yeah, I'll
But
do that.
it's essentially a paper published by a guy named William Amos of May of 2021 in the one of the Royal Society publications. And the title of the paper is Correlated and Geographically Predictable Neanderthal and Denisovan Legacies Are Difficult to Reconcile with a Simple Model Based on Interbreeding. So he's essentially arguing that, you know, that certain modeling studies can actually produce an effect similar to interbreeding, but in fact it's due to a demographic effect, not interbreeding. So it's an interesting perspective that I don't know necessarily how
a demographic,
widely.
if it be something like what?
Like population sizes expanding and contracting and then fracturing, right? Yeah, that's what. Yeah. So anyway, it's something that you know that again is an interesting, you know, perspective that is, you know, based on modeling. I don't know how widely accepted that this study will be, but it, you know, that really shouldn't matter. I mean, the question is, you know, is this guy making an effective point? And it's one of those articles that I've been intended to blog about, but just have gotten distracted and haven't really gone through the paper in detail to feel comfortable yet to blog about it. But I just thought it was interesting, you know, in light of our conversation that you know, there might be another way to explain that the so-called interbreeding data.
Yeah, so it's always very intriguing how new data coming to the stage and new ideas can actually make those paradigm shifts, right? From and that actually bias to a certain idea can have plenty of effect on interpretation of existing data, filling the gaps with the philosophical stance, maybe. So it remains the third question, which was, whether Neanderthals turn out to be a race of humans or humans were completely distinct from Neanderthals. How is it possible genetically, given what we know today, that a pair of humans can have all the genetic diversity that exists today in humans?
Yeah, you know, and that, you know, that argument has been used to, you know, to try to, you know, make the claim that there's no way, you know, there could be an Adam and an Eve as the first couple that gave rise to all humanity.
Yeah.
And, you know, there's some interesting work done by Anne Gager and a mathematician in Europe. I can't remember the country, but Olaf Hasser. And they actually made the point that nobody has really done the study starting with two individuals to see if indeed you could generate the genetic diversity. And they argued that two people at 500,000 years ago could generate, you know, that started humanity, could generate the diversity you need or you observe today. And depending on how you adjust their model, you can actually have those two individuals living about 100,000 years ago.
Wow.
and generate that type of genetic diversity. And our friend Josh Swamidas, who, by the way, I conveyed your greetings to him when I saw him in St. Louis a few weeks ago. But yeah, he enjoyed spending time with you. So
thanks. Yeah.
But you know, he points out that, you know, this claim that the genetic data demands about 10,000 individuals is actually not a minimum population size, but actually a time average population size. So in other words, that you would say that over the span of, let's say, 5,000 years, the average population size was 100,000 or 10,000, let's say. But it doesn't mean that at any point in that window, you couldn't actually have two individuals, right? So it doesn't exclude the idea that there could have been two individuals. So, and then plus I've seen studies in conservation biology where people are trying to correlate genetic diversity markers with, population size, and like when you're dealing with species that are about to go extinct, oftentimes biologists will have a really good idea of how many individuals actually exist, and they'll monitor, those populations as they grow in size, and genetic diversity. As those populations recover, genetic diversity is really very important for the health of that population. And so they have shown time and time again that the relationship between genetic diversity and population size, based on these types of models that are used to estimate human origin, the population sizes of humans at the time of our origin, actually those models break down. Many times they actually don't successfully predict genetic diversity from known population sizes, or you're getting a genetic diversity that's much greater than you would have thought from the population size that the population started with, as the conservation efforts were underway. So I'm not completely convinced that those models necessarily are as reliable or as robust as people claim them to be. So I think it's hard pressed to say that the genetics can prove that humanity came from two individuals, but I don't think the data can rule it out either.
So the question would be, if Adam and Eve were, for example, I don't know, both, I don't know, black, they had black eyes or brown eyes or something, and both had black hair or whatever, how can we have, blue eyes and blonde hair? Is from where will the genotype, the new genotype, come? Will those models assume mutation or
yeah. And I've seen a fair amount of work that's been done on the origin of regional differences in humanity, or origin of what you might call racial diversity. And that it's essentially mutational events that are that you could see as microevolutionary type of changes, and in some instances the differences, which are largely superficial, will provide some advantages for people living in different environmental conditions. So for example, radiation of heat away from the body, a flat nose is optimal in terms of efficient breathing, and then the dark skin actually protects things like the folic acid in the skin from undergoing degradation. And so it's an advantage. When you move to northern latitudes, having a shorter, more barrel-shaped body with shorter limbs helps to retain heat. A longer nose gives space for the air to warm up before it goes into your lungs. And then the light skin actually allows for effective vitamin D synthesis, much more rapid vitamin D synthesis. And so you could say that some of the differences that you see between people near the equator versus in northern latitudes are again microevolutionary differences that have an adaptive value. Some of the differences that you see from population to population are due to involve facial features, and these are called signaling traits. Where certain population groups just see certain qualities as being more or less desirable, and if they're more desirable, then you have a mechanism of sexual selection. So I always tell my wife that I really like her signaling traits. She doesn't think that to be too romantic of a gesture, but
Yeah.
So,
Okay. That's interesting. So,
so in other
yeah,
words,
go ahead.
but then once these mutations happen, because the human populations that were migrating were relatively small, they'll spread within that population quickly, and you kind of have a mechanism called let's see, surfing the genetic wave, where if you have this population where there's a where serially you have populations that break off, continue to break off as the migrations happen, those population sizes get smaller and smaller, and you're able to actually very quickly spread any kind of advantageous genetic change or any kind of you know sexual selection effect. It spreads very quickly, and so in very short order you can have regional differences in human beings, uh, you know that can be explained just simply through microevolutionary mechanisms.
I was wondering if, for example, we can actually. I have this idea. So it's let me give you an example. This movie Fifth Element, for example. Okay. Now, regardless the absurd part of the movie, but in this movie, for example, they're showing this person who is the heroine in this case, and she has DNA that's different from typical DNA. So my question is, why would we rule out that Adam and Eve had special genetic composition that then was made it possible that this genetic diversity radiates out of them and then plateaus through their progeny later, and then the branches that come from them would have, like, there is like a concentration of traits that then dilutes, and each diluted copy would be a race on its own or something. Is this something that somebody has actually looked at? I've heard about something like genetic drives, maybe.
Yeah.
What's your idea about that? Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, it's possible. It might be very challenging to demonstrate that to be the case scientifically, but it's definitely possible. Uh, there was somebody that used to work at Reasons to Believe, which is the organization that I work for, who suggested the idea of Eve having a number of different, that each one of her eggs had a distinct genetic composition. And so, the Old Testament describes Eve as the mother of every living person. And so her proposal was, could the eggs that Eve had, each one have a distinct genetic signature? So even though Adam may have had a singular genome in each egg, and so when you start calculating the number of possible eggs that Eve would have, and then if each one is different in the number of potential children she could have, that this may be a way you could account for the genetic diversity. So it's an idea that's, I think, along the same line, maybe not identical to your idea, but along the same lines. I mean, it's, in a sense, it's not a testable idea, but you could model it, and if the modeling works, you could say that it's a possibility, right?
Yeah, I think this is an interesting proposal. It's untestable, of course, and it need not be testable. But I mean, but another possibility that I was thinking of is something like what happened in the Lansky experiment, for example, where there are hidden potentials in the genome of a creature that get triggered after long exposure to a variation in the environment. And because human beings have this very large generation length versus bacteria, I think this will also be hardly testable. But I think there are some clues in human history, like lactose intolerance. Obviously, the evolutionary model explains it by random mutation. But there is another explanation that it is actually sort of maybe transposition, or I don't know, a manifestation of an existing mechanism that turns off lactose intolerance for some people after long exposure to milk products, for example. So my question is it at least hypothetically or theoretically possible that even humans, children of Adam and Eve, have those features on them that can be manifested by long exposure to conditions that then unfold a new race of human beings just by exposure? And then it will typically be very difficult to trace it back, because you cannot. I don't think we can trace back what happened in the Lenski experiment by hindsight. If we just find the final strains, we couldn't have guessed how they happened unless we were witnessing it. What do you what's your thoughts about that?
Yeah, I mean, it's definitely possible, and I'm not sure how this would necessarily impact your model, but when you look at the work that's being done in epigenetics, what is being discovered is kind of a Lamarckian type of evolution, where exposure to certain things in the environment actually trigger difference, changes in gene expression that are then heritable, to subsequent generations. And so I don't think you're necessarily positing an epigenetic mechanism, but there could maybe be a genetic analog to what you're saying.
Yeah.
Right.
Right.
I don't know that, and again, we know that there are, parts of the genome that are silenced, and that there are, mutations that occur in hotspots. So, if those mutations that occur in hotspots are triggered by environmental effects, they could be, could unleash, right, some kind of, genetic potential that's not necessarily expressed,
Yeah.
and right. So I guess there are mechanisms that I can think of that would intersect with that idea that you're suggesting. I'd have to give it some more thought to see if those mechanisms actually would support it. But I think, at least superficially, or at least at first glance, it seems like they would be mechanisms that would be compatible with what you're saying.
I mean, we have like 98, maybe 98.5% of our genome outside what we call coding genes. Yeah. That
Yes.
we barely have an idea of what it does.
Yes.
It's definitely not there because our cells like having 98.5% sitting there doing nothing, consuming energy, replicating all the time. And according to the ENCODE project, it is being transcribed, most of it, but we don't know what it's doing. So I think that if we just know about 1.5%, it's not really, very far-fetched that this 98% has some function that relates to making sure that the human will live in very diverse environments, so that people can live from Alaska to the equator, and from high mountains to deep valleys, and from living by the sea and living in the middle of the desert. So there you will have all those diversities in color and length and body shape, etc., color of eyes and hair and skin, etc., and even blood type and other things. But then this might not be an outrageous hypothesis, would it be?
No, I mean, I don't think it is. I don't think it is at all. I think it's, it's definitely worth entertaining.
Yeah. So let's because today was took that unexpected turn, but let's close it like this: if at all Neanderthals were not fully human, and as you were saying, the primary genetic difference is in areas that relate to really what makes modern humans, neurological advancement, and maybe this relates to symbolism and other stuff. That if a human does interbreed with a Neanderthal, wouldn't that produce a retarded human, sort of, kind of thing? And why would
Yeah,
a
well,
human interbreed with a creature that is obviously retarded?
yeah,
I can't
yeah.
really absorb it.
Well, we have these conversations, all the time, you know, and you know, uh, just in terms of full disclosure, you know, my life would be easier if humans and Neanderthals had not interbred, right? That my job would be much easier. But I think if we're being fair with the data, uh, you know,
Yeah,
uh, the study that I posted aside,
yeah,
we have to say, look, there's a strong case that can be made for interbreeding. And so then it raises, some uncomfortable theological issues. And you know, for Christians, the question is, well, you know, um, it did these hybrids, these human Neanderthal hybrids, have the image of God? Did they have, what do we do with that? And in Christian theology, there are two models for how ensoulment. The theological term in Christian theology is ensoulment. How does ensoulment
mm,
happen? And one idea is something called traducianism, where uh, just like there's a physical inheritance that our children receive from both parents. There's also a spiritual inheritance where there's somehow a blending of the soul that you know produces that soul in the child. And the other view is called creationism, where God is creating a soul in each human being individually at the time of their conception, or at some point after their conception. and
yeah.
and
Actually, this is actually the Islamic view,
yeah,
that there is, yeah,
yeah,
specific soul for each person. Yeah,
so both models have biblical support. And so it's just. And so I've done a little project saying, okay, if it's creationism, you could say that God would have said, look, I'm going to honor the fact that this individual has a human parent, and so therefore I'm going to impart into that offspring the image of God. And then the other point would be, well, in traducianism, if you see the image of God as being indivisible, it's either there or not there, then even if one parent has the image of God, the offspring would have the image of God. So those are two models that could preserve kind of the uniqueness or the exceptional nature of the hybrid, without you know, at least from a Christian theological perspective. But we're essentially treading in a very dangerous terrain as we try to speculate along those
yeah,
lines. But
yeah, yeah. So at least there are two exits to that. So the first one is that maybe Neanderthals are just human race, maybe,
yeah,
and maybe what we think is, since we don't have them here standing to as witness for themselves, maybe they were not retarded or anything, and
right.
we, yeah,
That's a possibility, right?
yeah, because let's face it, we don't really know what the genetic system does. We just know when we see it, sort of. Yeah, we're still experimenting with it. I Would you agree to that? So we don't see the if today somebody gets out from the lab and gives a composed genome to a biologist and tells him, please draw to me the creature that will come out from this genome, would he be able to say this is creature X, which looks like this exactly,
No, nobody
has
has. I
these
mean,
features?
yeah. I mean, that's the problem. I mean, the big question in biology today is how does the genotype relate to the phenotype? Nobody knows that. And we do know that there must be a relationship because we change the genotype and we can see phenotypic changes. But how that happens is, the gigantic question mark right now.
Yeah, so starting from there, that the relation, that the connecting lines is actually very meshy and very fuzzy. Maybe what we think is, okay, this is the part of the genome that makes humans neurologically developed. Maybe there was another part in what we call Neanderthals that made them also neurologically developed. And essentially, those two races had this interplay or something.
Yeah.
So this might be one exit. And the other one is that, okay, they were just creatures prior to us, but same creator, same designer. He had same signature for both creatures for one reason or the other that we don't really understand. Maybe. There is actually, just to, like you've reflected on the Bible. So in the story of the creation of Adam in the Quran, and so it goes like this, and remember when your Lord told the angels, I'm going to create a successor on earth, a Khalifa. Khalifa means somebody who will come after someone else, and can also be translated as a ruler. That's why Caliph, and Caliphate comes from. And then the angels reply with a very mysterious response. They say, would you make on it, they mean earth, one who would cause corruption and shed blood? And the reason the response is very mysterious is, how would they know? So he's saying, God is saying, I'm creating a successor and a ruler, and they have a mental image of what some other previous kind of thing had in terms of corruption and shedding blood. And it always intrigues me, the fact that Neanderthals suddenly disappear by the time humans appear. There seems to be, we're coming, you're going, kind of. So that might be something. And it seems that since just when God told them, they had the comparison established, that maybe the new creature, which was Adam, looked like the previous creature, which might be the Neanderthal or something else. And this phenotypic similarity must have some genotypic similarity. Maybe this is the reason that those signatures are the same. And now we would, because we are maybe influenced by evolutionary thinking, even if we are creationists, that we would attribute that to some sort of mating or something.
Yeah.
So yeah, or maybe we'll never know. We'll just never know. But it was very interesting actually to learn about the models, about the how two people can actually produce all the diversity and different propositions. Maybe Eve had different eggs, each one caused a different race. And maybe some of my propositions, something like the Lenski experiment, but on humans, something like the 98% of the genome that we don't know what it's doing is actually what generates different races when the time is good for them. So yeah, that was actually a very exciting and different episode that I actually will change the title of the the episode between origin of life and origin of humanity, right? So we started by origin of life, and it took us to origin of humanity. So Fuz, this was actually a very interesting thing. Maybe it can be the basis of a series, because I really remember what you said last time about you spending like 30 years of your life studying anthropology, and it seems that you have plenty of jewels there. So we have to unearth them.
No, it might be fun to do a series where we, compare and contrast kind of different biblical models for human origins and Islamic models for human origins, and that could be just a fun conversation or a fun couple
Yeah,
of episodes just to
absolutely, absolutely. Actually, I was on this forum that actually Josh Swamiras had, and he was asking about, hey, what does Islam say about jinn? Okay, and because there's this mention of men of old and kind of um, previous creature in Genesis, and in Islam, this previous creature is actually not a material creature at all. It is the race that eventually is still there now. It's called jinn, and one of them is this notorious Satan character. So yeah. So there is actually plenty of stuff. I'm not sure if we're gonna be able to ever detect those guys, but they seem to be very elusive.
well,
So anyway, yeah,
but to me, if there's a moral to the story today, it would be this, that even though the people that are scientifically minded, that hold to an atheistic or a materialistic perspective, are very quick to dismiss the human origin account in Scripture, whether it's the Old Testament, or the Quran, that there are ways to reasonably integrate the scientific record with these ancient texts in a way that preserves the integrity of the human origin accounts, and and really shows that the scientific prescience of these texts. So that's, to me, the moral of the story. Even though we don't have it figured out, and we may never figure it out, it doesn't follow that science invalidates these human origins accounts.
Yeah, actually, I would like to conclude here with this ayah in the Quran. It says this. It says, "ما أشهدتهم خلق السماوات والأرض ولا خلق أنفسهم." I have not made them witness over the creation of the heavens and the earth, nor the creation of themselves. And وما كنت متخذ المضلين عضدا, and I would have not taken deceivers as aids or assistants. So it seems that God has sealed the deal here, that those two aspects of existence, the very origin of the cosmos and the exact story of how human came to existence, will remain limited to what he has told us about. Maybe because the secret of the soul, or the ensoulment aspect that you talked about, is so supernatural, it will remain outside of our scientific reach, maybe. So yeah, but anyway, I think this has been a very intriguing discussion, and doing the comparison between biblical accounts and the Quran and science is definitely something that would be novel, and definitely maybe not many have tried to do the same. So thank you very much for this exciting ride that we had today.
Yeah.
Origin of life research and origin of humanity research, anthropology research. Very, very interesting episode indeed. For everybody who's been following us, once again, have a great evening today, especially with this mid of Sha'ban event. And look out for our upcoming episode about DNA transcription. We've talked about replication today, and actually probably within the week I'm gonna repost the replication video with more editing on top of it, putting more graphics, etc. So look out for that, and I hope you've enjoyed today's episode. We have Omar Khan sending us love and a heart, and we have Ash saying thank you for the stream. And we have Ilyas saying excellent breakdown. So thank you guys for enjoying this. Please make sure to share it with as much as you can over Facebook and YouTube and Twitter and you name it. Thanks a lot, Fuz, for this stream of information on anthropology today, and obviously on biochemistry too. And see you all again soon. And have a great weekend, Fuz.
Thank you.
Thank you. So we'll be putting the extra now and wishing you all great weekends and a great evening. And here we go.